Tato, good evening. Welcome to this conversation, the second in our three-part series on the future of Auckland. I'm Rod Oram, and it's my very great pleasure and privilege to be the facilitator this evening. As you were coming in, that was a 30-minute video highlight from the first session, and that's going to have a wider audience in due course, so you'll be hearing from Ashley, who's organising these events, how to get hold of that in due course, and that will be shown to a wider audience too, just as this evening's will be likewise in due course. The future of Auckland is such a wonderful subject. I wonder if you won't mind if I indulge with one of my favourite quotes from one of my favourite people on the nature of cities, because we'll be hearing a lot of really important analysis tonight, but this is a way of thinking about the place we live in a rather different way, which I hope may contribute to this evening. This is from Lewis Mumford, the US sociologist, from his 1938 book, The Culture of Cities. The city is a fact of nature, like a cave, a run of mackerel, or an ant-heap. But it is also a conscious work of art, and in it holds, within its communal framework, many simpler and more personal forms of art. Mind takes form in the city, and in turn, urban form conditions mind. And so I think that this wonderful city with its extraordinary natural setting and a human-built form which has yet to reach its potential gives us a great hope for the future, I think, of the city. First of all, a few housekeeping things. In the unlikely event of the emergency, an alarm will sound. Just stay calm, and Aotea Centre staff will be escorting us out that way. I think that way is a bit of a dead end. Secondly, smoking is prohibited, of course, in the Aotea Centre and the car park downstairs. The bathrooms are a little hard to find. They're just out of the door, and then around here there's some stairs, and you go down the stairs and you'll find them down there. But then there's a water fountain just round there, the other side of that pillar, if you fancy some water in the meantime. And finally, please turn your phones to silent, but not off, because we will be using Slido as an interactive question and answer way of participating in the discussion. I'll come back to signing on to Slido in a moment. The idea and the impetus for this three-part series on the future of Auckland came from a number of leaders in council, and they were very intent on ensuring that the city responds strategically to the exciting opportunities it has for itself, particularly as we have responded to COVID and how that changes many things and opens up new possibilities. And right from the outset, this was envisaged to be a three-part series. So in the first session on March 31st, we had a wonderful panel laying out various themes about the city. So we had Michael Quinn, who I know is with us this evening, who's head of the government's Auckland Policy Office, discussing various the big issues that are on the mind of him and his colleagues. And then Helen Petousis-Harris, well-known vaccinologist and an associate professor at the University of Auckland. Patrick Reynolds, who is also with us this evening, an expert in urban design and transport and a current board member of Wakakotaki NZTA. Damon Salesa, the Associate Professor of Pacific Studies and Pro-Vice Chancellor Pacific at the university, who recently led the opening of the university's South Auckland campus. And Tania Pafari, the manager, the council's manager of Community and Social Innovation, who is doing, she and her colleagues are doing extraordinary work in South and West Auckland, particularly among Māori and Pacifica people. As I said, that highlights reel from that will be available in due course. So it was a very lively and challenging set of presentations and discussion. But crucially in the audience on that first evening were Sir Peter Gluckman and colleagues of his from Koitu, the Centre for Informed Futures at the University of Auckland, who were listening very hard, and they went away to continue the work that was already underway, thinking about the city and in the context, of course, of New Zealand and what's going on in the world. So it's a great pleasure to, the idea was that they would come back this evening to present the big issues and big opportunities they're seeing on their mind. So I'll do a proper introduction in due course, but I just wanted to welcome you, Sir Peter, and Dr. Anne Bardsley and Dr. Dornell Klein. A very big hand for them, please. Thank you. So between the three of them, they will be presenting sort of 5 segments on specific but quite broad topics. And then after each segment, we will have approximately about 10 minutes of discussion on each. So that's when the interactive bit is really important. There are 2 microphones here, so you could use those, and please do if you want to make a comment or ask a question, because that's very important for the video recording. Or you could go to slido.com and enter the code for this evening, which is #recovery, all lowercase, and ask your questions that way. And that'll be a great help to me because I can see those coming through and can work with those. And then in due course, there will be a 3rd session in this series, which will take the form of a planning workshop in Council on a date still to be set. And that 3rd leg will use the wealth of ideas and information that's been coming through in these first 2 sections. So that's the format for this evening. So it's a very great pleasure to welcome up, to give you a formal welcome, Phil Wilson, who's Head of Governance and CCO Partnerships for Auckland Council, to say a few words. A very warm welcome for Phil, please. Thank you.
No mai, piki mai, haere mai. Ina mana whenua o Tamaki Makaurau, tēnā koutou katoa, e rangatira mā o Tamaki. That's you guys. Welcome. Lovely to have you with us. We've got a slightly different audience to the first one. I can see a few more elected members, local board and governing body. Welcome. I have to be nice to you, you pay my wages. But a range of others. Thank you for being here. I just very quickly, I'm slightly superfluous, so I'll be very quick. I want to, right at the outset, thank Rod for helping guide us in this series and tonight. Good to see you, Rod. To Anna and Ashley, who are here, who did the organising, thank you. To Councillor Chris Darby, and my words not his, Phil, get off your ass and help us think through some of the more strategic implications of COVID and what we might contemplate in terms of coming out of this with an eye on the future and leveraging whatever opportunities out of the kind of darkness of last year, I suppose. So I should say thank you, Chris, for the prompting, but also to Rod's point, we want this to ultimately lead to some thinking about tangible things, and therefore we want to circle back in the latter part of the series, the 3rd and beyond, into, well, what are we actually going to do? The discussion is vitally interesting, and no doubt sort of stimulating to everyone, but the action ultimately counts, right? So that's the way we've designed this in terms of the series of 3 events. So look, thanks for your commitment of some of your evening tonight. Thanks for your intellectual and other input as we go through, and I hope you enjoy it. I'll leave it to you, Rod. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Phil. And now it's my great pleasure to welcome up Sir Peter. As I mentioned, Peter heads up Koitu, which he and colleagues started up after he had done his very long and distinguished stint as Chief Science Advisor to the Prime Ministers. Peter, in addition to all this Koitu work, also carries on a number of international roles, such as chair of the International Network of Government Science Advisors, and then as president-elect of the International Science Council. So, Peter, thank you very much for being here with us, and a very warm welcome for him, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I thought we'd start this evening with talking about the COVID situation before we move on to other things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we see the COVID pandemic playing out, not over 1 year, but over the next decade. And then we'll talk about the issues that we've been asked by Auckland Unlimited to look at, some general issues about the positioning of Auckland and where it might go, the opportunities and the challenges, and then talk particularly about the innovation dimension of that, and then finally about the social and human dimension of that, and try to bring that together in the work that we've been asked to do. So, as Rod just mentioned, I'm President-elect of the International Science Council, which is the global body that represents both the natural, social sciences, and indeed a number of the humanities, and which is the body that the United Nations recognises representing science and its broader dimensions in the world of multilateralism. And late last year, when the vaccines started to be available and politicians started putting out the message, it's all over, we have the vaccines, it's all over, life will turn back to normal rather rapidly, we had a discussion amongst ourselves and with a number of very distinguished people, and we decided it was important to actually have a scenarios project that looks ahead what's really likely to happen and how decisions made in the next 12 months might impact on how the pandemic evolves. And that ended up being a partnership with WHO, the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Organisation, and the International Science Council, on a project which I lead or chair the oversight of. Some of our team are directly involved in it, but involves on the oversight board some of the world's most distinguished epidemiologists, some of whom you've seen on CNN and other channels quite a lot, and involves some of the world's leading economists, well, some of the world's leading social scientists and political scientists, and it's keeping me awake an awful lot, a lot of Zoom calls every night. And we're thinking about in terms of 5 dimensions. And I think we need to recognise that this is a multidimensional problem that we face. The first dimension is actually the easiest to understand. It's the biological dimension. We have a virus. It's going to continue to mutate. It is a virus. If you had to design a virus which was going to cause a pandemic, it is almost the perfect virus you would define. Long, significant asymptomatic incubation period, doesn't kill everybody, spreads very rapidly, and it mutates quite easily. So we have the virus, and with a large population infected, it will continue to mutate. Some of those mutations will matter, some of them will not matter. Then we have the vaccine, and the vaccine works now, or at least the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccines work very well. But we have issues of production, we have issues of supply, we have issues of changed efficacy against disease, how long will the vaccine last, the duration, etc., etc. And it's not without cost. You see, the government pointed out today they're going to spend well over $1 billion on the vaccine. We can afford to. Many countries can't. We can afford to when we have to revaccinate at some unknown time in the future. Many countries will not be able to. At the current rate of supply and production, the world will not be vaccinated before 2024. And even that may be optimistic if recurrent vaccination is needed. Furthermore, we have a problem of hesitancy. Recent Australian surveys suggest that only 70% of people will get vaccinated. Japan, it will be lucky to be 50%. France, less than that. And so we have a problem that while we as a country with a high level of social trust will probably achieve high vaccination rates, many countries will not. And that, of course, has implications for how social measures can be changed. Because what the vaccine is doing, and it's become very apparent in Singapore and Taiwan in the last 2 weeks, is the vaccine will stop you getting sick. It will reduce your chances of transmitting the virus, carrying the virus and transmitting it, but it doesn't obviate it altogether. And so at some point when borders open, it is inevitable the virus will come into the country. Inevitable. There's no way around that. Even if everybody coming in is vaccinated and if everybody's screened with rapid testing, probably the virus will still get in. And if you just do the sums on if only 90% of the population get vaccinated, that still leaves 1 million people unvaccinated, or at least 700,000 adults unvaccinated, of which a number of whom will be vulnerable people. And that leads to the giant political dilemma I'm going to come back to in a moment for a country like New Zealand that starts from a low viral burden situation. How do you move a population that's become paranoid about one case of the virus occurring to one accepting that there will be cases, like there is people die of the flu every year? That is going to be a very hard political and social discourse. Very, very hard indeed. And we should not underestimate what that will mean. And so if you think about where this is going to go, you have countries now with high viral burdens, like United States or Europe, that can afford to vaccinate their way out of it if the people comply. You have countries like New Zealand that have low viral burdens and can afford to vaccinate to a level of high levels of resistance, but not absolute protection. And then you have low-income countries that have high viral burdens and will be years away from being fully protected. And countries like Vietnam that have low viral burdens are poor, and what will happen to them? How will they maintain their low viral burden state? And yet at some point in the future this has all got to harmonise if you are ever going to return to free travel without all the issues around it. Very complicated. And that's easy compared to the next dimension, which is the social dimension. So at the best will in the world, we're going to be thinking about this virus from a point of view of the medical, evolutionary, vaccine, movement point of view for another 4 or 5 years, in some level or another. How it happens in each individual country, of course, is going to depend very much on local decisions that are made, largely about the acceptability of it becoming endemic. The second issue is the dimension one. We've already seen so-called vaccine fatigue, where social measures are being resisted. We've seen the confusion of ideology and social measure compliance or resistance in a number of countries. Will you mask or not has become a badge of political statement in some countries. Then we have a large number of issues around families that have been subject to social disruption. New Zealand perhaps less than many countries where the mortality and morbidity rate has been very high, but then yet that doesn't mean that there have not been people who've failed to get to funerals, failed to get to a wedding, etc., 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 because of what's gone on. But I think mental health is the one we must think about more and more. We know now in Christchurch the burden of mental health is double that, or mental ill health, double of that which it was before the earthquake. That may not apply to every New Zealander, but a lot of New Zealanders will have been made more vulnerable because of what's happened over the last year. And the most vulnerable group of those are young adolescents or adolescents who've had their schooling interrupted, their career choices interrupted. And we already have a major problem of youth mental health, which this country refuses to acknowledge and act upon. 35% of Maori and Pacifica young women of school age are mentally unwell, do not have optimal mental health. 25% of young Maori and Pacifica men do. 25% of young Pākehā women, the same. So you can't have a society with those levels of burden. The rates were half that a decade ago. We need to think seriously about the issues ahead of us. Educational disruption is a huge issue. The experts like Stuart McNaughton will tell you that particularly those people at the late school years, will never fully recover the deficit that's been created by the interruption in their training and schooling. And then, of course, all of us know about the small business owners, the tourist operators, the pilot, the air travel, the travel agent who've lost their careers and are not going to rebuild them in a hurry, their businesses. We've also got a changed rate, and remember I'm talking here globally, not just about New Zealand, about the increased rates of welfare dependency around the world. How will countries exit those? And I think that we are seeing already that COVID is a catalyst for disrupting social cohesion in a number of societies. You put this all together and you can see a decade ahead in which the social echoes of COVID will persist. I'm not going to talk a lot about economics because it's not my strongest suit. But again, at the economic level, we've got the microeconomic changes which I've largely talked about. But I also think the consequence of the K-shaped political recovery, or economic recovery, is going to be a greater focus on the issues of inequity. I think there's no doubt that those issues were there before COVID. They've been exacerbated by COVID. And I think we're seeing the start of a discussion about a change in the political economy across the democratic countries. There's also a shifting global focus which will impact on a country like New Zealand of shorter supply lines and so forth. At the macroeconomic level, quantitative easing probably will not be a huge issue in a country like New Zealand. It might have a small inflationary effect, but the real issue is going to be debt and debt, particularly in countries of middle-income countries, which have gone into debt to cover with vaccines, and how that may play out in terms of triggering some economic downturns is something the economists are quite worried about. At the governance level, and I'm going to move quite quickly because of time, there's an interesting phenomenon going on. We've seen a greater interest in the use of autocratic processes in Western democracies. So we've seen a reduction in consultation. It's extended well beyond COVID emergency into other areas of decision making, and there's quite a lot of concern about that. And when you add to that those countries that have not done well, unlike New Zealand, which has had a rise in trust in government in the last year, you've seen in many countries a rapid decline in trust in government. And of course, there are people making mischief against that background with disinformation campaigns. And the political scientists are very worried about the future of democracy in this context. Again, plays into social cohesion. And then we have the geostrategic clock, which has already been in play. Right from the outset, geostrategic issues interfered with the pandemic being managed properly in the acute phase, certainly by China, but also by the World Health Organization. And we happen to be in a situation, a phase globally, where multilateralism was already weak. And sadly, it's not been strengthened in the last year. And I think the issues for us in New Zealand around a weak multilateral system, because we rely very much on a rules-based global order, are quite worrisome. Will it be responded? I think will it be repaired, enhanced? I'd like to say yes. Do I think it will? It's pretty uncertain. I mean, all said and done, we're a year and a half into the pandemic. The United Nations has not met once about it. The Security Council has not met once about the greatest existential risk the world has faced. There are real issues here. It's also been diversionary, allowing other regional issues to blow up. I think we're seeing one at play in the Middle East right at the moment because the major player's mind has been elsewhere. So where does all of that lead Auckland, New Zealand's gateway? Well, we're caught in this conundrum of when will the borders open up? And if you think about it, it's going to be dependent on vaccine uptake by New Zealanders, particularly in our vulnerable populations, Māori, Pacifica, Asian migrants. They are the vulnerable populations that will need to have high vaccine coverage before we dare really open the borders. The government has been repeatedly clear that it is nervous about vaccine efficiency against transmission as opposed to disease. And that remains a conundrum, but with rapid testing, particularly rapid saliva testing, anterior nasal swab testing, it is possible to see regimens where triage at the border, rapid testing, short quarantine could be done. But there are two things that we need to recognise. New Zealand lives in a risk-averse environment. It has been promoted innocently, and I think I'm not being critical, in the COVID era. We've seen one case causes flat panic at every level. And so we have two things. Politics with a small p, which is how society operates, and politics with a capital P, that are going to have to handle this transition from epidemic management, which is what we're doing now, with tight shutdown of the borders, to endemic management, where we accept there will be cases across the border, but hopefully enough people are vaccinated that the burden of the disease breaking out is minimal. But it comes right back to this point that the ability to move is both, on the biological side, it's easy. We could vaccinate everybody and then we wouldn't have a problem. The problem is not everybody will get vaccinated, and therefore some really complicated political issues ahead. And that's the dilemma that faces Auckland as the gateway city. How will this play out over 6, 9 months, 2 years? It's going to take time. I mean, at the rate we're going, we still do not know the level of vaccine hesitancy that will actually be at play in, say, South Auckland or West Auckland or East Auckland over the next 6 months. That is going to be the critical issue which determines when the government decides to move. So I'm going to stop there, just open it up for any questions on the vaccine before we move on.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. Any questions on that vaccine and pandemic outlook? Can I just add one, if I may? It's this very interesting point, a very crucial point you're raising about New Zealand adjusting to more cases as the border opens. Can you offer some ways in which we could be working on that problem and beginning to encourage people in that view that this is necessary and inevitable?
Well, I think the first thing is to talk about
Oh, sorry,
I think the first thing is to talk about it. What we have not done in New Zealand in the last 6 months is talk a lot about these issues, which should be self-evident that there's trade-offs in all directions, and there's no real discussion going on in the public domain in which the discussion is other than we have made the decisions, this is what we're doing. So that's one. I happen to do the peer review for the Irish government on rapid testing. And while they're coming from a different perspective from us, because they're coming from a moderately high viral load to a low load, they're putting in place an enormous amount of rapid testing as a way which can be done quite cheaply, probably at scale, $5 to $10 a test, 20-minute turnaround on it, turns out to be very accurate. It can be even done at home, as you know now in America, there are now home testing. And what they're doing is they're putting it everywhere, into schools, into shopping centres, everywhere, just to try and keep the levels at the low level they're striving to get. If you think about it from our point of view, we should be introducing the norm of rapid testing early, so that as the border starts to open, the places where that is where we're going to pick it up and keep it under some sort of control. Again, if we could get the vaccination rates really high, this would be a lot easier to deal with. And then there are other decisions which we have to come to. Are we only going to let vaccinated people into New Zealand? If so, what vaccines count as being vaccinated? If you take, I mean, I don't, probably none of you are reading the COVID story as like I'm having to read it, but look at the Seychelles, the country with the highest rate of vaccination in the world. But unfortunately, it was a Chinese vaccine which had only 50% efficacy, as it turned out. And so they've had a massive outbreak of a massive outbreak of disease. They thought they had done the right thing. They had vaccinated virtually all their population. It turned out to be a lousy vaccine.
Any other questions or thoughts, Peter? I'm just going to add one more, if I may. You quite rightly laid out those 5 dimensions, many of those issues there being extremely challenging. But do you think there are some aspects from the pandemic and the way we've responded that are actually positives?
Yes.
As we work through these issues? And what would be on your mind there?
Well, funnily enough, on my mind immediately comes climate change in a funny way, because I think that this has been the biggest existential threat anybody alive today has faced. And it's a real existential threat. It's shown the multilateral system is weak. It also showed the national systems were very weak. I mean, if you look at what has been said to virtually every government in the world by people such as myself and Anne over the last few years, high risk of a zoonotic pandemic. Very high risk, inevitable. We've actually had a number of close calls with MERS, SARS, etc., etc. It was inevitable it was going to happen. Some of you may have seen Anne and myself recently released a report on New Zealand's risk system. The risk system in New Zealand, risk assessment, risk management system is weak in public governance. It's no better in most other countries. This is actually where the action has to take place. The third thing, which is really important, Rod, is, as I mentioned, the weak state of the multilateral system. And that's where Helen Clark's report is very valuable. It's not, I wouldn't say it's the only possible solution, but it's a valuable impetus that we do need the multilateral system, and maybe with Biden taking over from Trump, there is an opportunity for that discussion to take place. But it's difficult. It's very difficult to see how we would get reform of the multilateral system. My own view, and Helen Clark's report also goes there, and we've been doing a lot of work on this indirectly with her, has been we need an independent pandemic management agency at a global level that can actually has the powers of, no different to the Office of Chemical and Biological Warfare or any of those kinds of organisations. Otherwise, we're not going to get on top of it.
Thanks. Look, there is just one question. There is one question here which I'd like to ask that's come through on Slido. With shorter supply chains, do you see this impacting on our export markets?
Yes, I do, and I'm not sure whether Anne's going to talk a bit about that in a moment. But I think, and those of us who've looked at business commentary, as Rod's looked at it far more than I have, over the last 12 months, will see around the world there's issues of moving from just and now to resilient supply chain thinking is going on all over the place. And one of those things is shorter supply lines. And that, I think, to what extent it will affect us, I don't know. It's already affected us in one way. Export education will never go back to what it was. And export education is a form of a different kind of supply line. But we're going to do export education only by exporting electronically more than importing people. There's no way around the world that export education will return to where it was.
Right, thank you. Now, so that's you for this first section, and now we're going to hand over... Oh, sorry, yes? Patrick, yes. Hang on a second. Microphone is coming to save you getting up. Yeah. Okay, just so we get this on the video. Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, Peter. Is this on?
Yep.
Could you expand a little more on the lessons from COVID on to the climate emergency?
Well, yes, because I think what has been learned in that is that the relationship to evidence and policy making and politics has had to be adjusted rapidly in COVID. Can those lessons be sustained into the climate change, I don't know what we want to call it, the catastrophe on the way? Can the fact that the multilateral system at some levels, I've been critical at some levels, but at some levels it worked very well. I mean, the way the vaccines were produced rapidly by scientists across multiple countries, and both the public and private sector, particularly the private sector, coming together was very effective. Can those lessons be learnt to actually find ways to strengthen the way UNCCC, etc. work? I mean, rather than just being big conferences, I think the specifics of producing a vaccine showed what technologies can be developed rather rapidly if you move fast. Can we do that on other areas which would be relevant to climate change?
Peter, it's Michael Quinn. The piece that you presented there on the transitions, it seems very complex, and it's good to bring up. It's more complex than I thought it was. There's a lot of people who are keen to open the borders as quickly as possible. There's a lot of businesses that are reliant on that, and there's a lot of communities who are really worried about those borders being open. So on those transition issues, have you got a view on when we should start that conversation, how we should do it, and who should be doing it?
Well, I think the first thing to do is the talking has to start, because it's inevitable at some point we will have to open the borders in some way. There are ways we could open the border more now, with rapid testing, with shorter periods of quarantine, with traceability on people. I mean, I need to travel to Paris, let's say, to the International Science Council. I'm vaccinated, I have a test, I come back, I'm negative, I go into self-quarantine for 5 days with further testing. But I have to wear an ankle bracelet to show that I am in self-quarantine. If you don't want an ankle bracelet, you go into a hospital, into an MIQ, and you pay for it. There are systems that, I'm making that up, but the point I'm making is there are intermediate steps if you think it through, and you think it partly depends where you're coming from. Clearly, if you're coming from India, we've already got different rules in place, so if you come from the Cook Islands or from Australia. But we've seen with Taiwan and with Singapore that if you don't have rapid response systems in place and are willing to respond quickly, you're back, and you don't have everybody vaccinated, you're back into the community spread issue again. And so that's the dilemma. And I think until you come back all the way, yes, you could open up a bit, as we have for Australia, as we might be able to do in Singapore in a few months' time, or Taiwan. But you come back to the risk profile, as New Zealanders see the risk profile of this disease, is unacceptable until you get a very high vaccination rate. And that's the situation we're in, because we're coming from a low viral exposure into an environment of accepting endemic exposure, which is very different to going from London or Paris or Munich, where you're going from a high viral exposure and you're going down and you're accepting, and there's a different acceptance in the population of priority. And we've just got to accept that there's this fully understandable, both big P and little p, political dimension to decision making. But the best thing about all of this is discussion. Makes it easier for the politician.
I'm sorry not to turn to you, because we've got a complicated programme tonight, and I'm trying to keep more or less on track. But don't worry, there's going to be a catch-all session at the end. So hold that question for now, thank you. Now, in the second leg of the presentations, it's a great pleasure to welcome up to Dr. Anne Bardsley, who is the deputy head of Koitu, and before that was the chief analyst when Peter was chief science advisor. Very warm welcome for Anne, please. Thank you. And Anne is going to tell you about the work Koitu has been doing on futures and applying some of the main themes to Auckland. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Yes, I'm going to start off from where Peter left off. Really, he's been talking about the work to try to understand the possible trajectories going forward from COVID. And as you saw from those 5 dimensions, it really has to be looked at from a systemic point of view. And the scenarios are going to be quite complicated and complex for different countries and different regions. And we haven't quite worked out how many scenarios we'll end up with from those 5 dimensions and how they intertwine. But the issues that we've been facing have been with us for a long time. COVID has just shone a light on them and accelerated some of the trends that we already knew were going on. And in a way, it really has given us a chance to rethink our strategies about how we move forward, or indeed our lack of strategy in a lot of cases. We won't and we shouldn't really go back to a pre-COVID normality. This is an opportunity to think about the future and how we're tracking ahead and how we can actually do that better. And most of the speakers from last week, last session actually spoke about how we can do better in various ways, be it in transport, in our urban form and design, and how we view tourism and education. But it was also noted that in some ways, and I think it was Patrick might have said it, that because we didn't actually suffer as badly as some other cities have, we don't have that burning platform, I think you might have said, that would inspire us to make a change. And we are already pretty complacent in a lot of ways. Yes, our borders are closed and a lot of things are still affected, but we're kind of going about living our lives pretty normally, and it can quite easily fall back into patterns that are not going to be helpful if we're really trying to think about the long-term issues. And so that's an opportunity that we hadn't picked up on. And indeed, like New Zealand, as we know, we've been in the spotlight in a good way for our response to COVID, and we have an opportunity to capitalize on that in our export markets in various ways. But that window is closing. You know, other countries are getting vaccinated. There's a different attitude. Yes, we are a safe haven, but as Peter mentioned, that's not going to be forever. And we can't just keep our borders tight shut. We're going to have to figure out how to open them, and we have to think about how we will deal with some endemic virus in our presence, and what that means for our situation as an advantage that we had that is closing a bit. We still do have the opportunity to grab some of these opportunities because the decisions that we're making today will have long-ranging consequences, either for good or bad, for our collective future. So we all come here from Koitu, the Center for Informed Futures, and we're established when Peter stepped down as Chief Science Advisor as a think tank to focus on long-term thinking about the complex issues New Zealand is facing in the future. The slides just showing what we're about, that we are defined by transdisciplinarity, meaning we take in perspectives from all kinds of disciplines, but we also involve stakeholders and the public in framing the questions that we seek to address. It involves systems thinking and a futures focus. and we do things from a strong evidence base, all coming from various science backgrounds, including social sciences and economics now, including with Donnell, who will speak in a bit. But the conversations that we're facilitating are about these complex and long-term problems that require a lot of different voices to come to the table. That's obviously the case with the future of Auckland, and good to see all of you here in the room and all of the different types of voices that we're trying to bring to this question. But last year, so I think Peter mentioned, we only launched last year by the Governor General on the 4th of March 2020, and a few short weeks later we were launched into lockdown. So we quickly adapted to that, and we did bring a lot of different voices to a room. It was a Zoom room, and we had many conversations initially about the current situation, but mostly with a focus on where is this going, and how can we bring all these voices together to think about the future in this situation where we have a potential to reset some of our systems, because at that point we were in a hard lockdown, and in fact. So that led to a series of reports and conversations under the title "The Future Is Now." These two report covers that you see are the bookends. The first one, which we produced in April of 2020, so that was during lockdown. We had many conversations with strategic thinkers, business leaders, academics, a whole range of people, to discuss various issues, and culminated. Well, we're still having these conversations, but the other bookend was in November of last year, and the main message was that no matter how well we initially coped with the pandemic hitting our shores, the impacts on society were likely to be so wide-ranging and profound that they could and should possibly trigger a reset. That it was an opportunity for these national careful considerations of our aspirations as a nation, and now also as a city in Auckland, and what direction we should take as we look beyond the immediate to the medium and longer term. So some of the issues that came up are already touched on by Peter in those dimensions of the COVID scenarios. This slide just shows some of the questions that were raised, and our papers were mostly provocations to start those conversations and make people try to think about having a strategy for the future. They involved questions on what geostrategic consequences would we expect, and how New Zealand might respond, how different sectors of our economy might move forward, etc. But there was also a lot of focus on this issue of social cohesion, that we were showing ourselves to be quite cohesive, but that was potentially fragile. It relies on an environment of trust and transparent decision making. So we showed that we've got good, as Peter mentioned, trust vertically with our government, but also horizontally in our society. And that's something we need to think about how we maintain and actually leverage for the future. So we do have an opportunity to approach all these questions by establishing trusted partnerships and truly engaging a wider society in the private sector, NGOs, academia, and government in these critical conversations to work towards those, to try to start to answer some of these questions. And this is one of those conversations we're having now. So these are just some of those. Over that time period of various lockdowns, we produced 8 or 9 different reports on these conversations. Lots of different groups almost entirely on Zoom, I'm pretty sure. We didn't actually have a physical space ourselves. So we did deal with some of these issues that Peter touched on, including the geostrategic question, New Zealand's place in the world. Peter did, Peter mentioned some of what we saw going on, which was a reversal of globalism and the shrinking of supply lines, countries turning in on themselves and trying to be a bit more self-sufficient, and what would that mean for New Zealand's export economy, changes of trade patterns, and etc. We also talked about the influence of digital and other technologies on the way we function as individuals and societies. We saw it take on a completely new meaning during lockdown, but we also saw the agility of education systems, not always equitably, and shone a light on digital divides and those important issues to address. But prior to COVID, just back to the trade issue, as we know, New Zealand's economy was, and still is highly dependent on trade with China, Australia, the US, and Europe, and focusing on a commodity-based trade and services-based export industries, including tourism and education, which clearly took a major hit. As Peter mentioned, export education won't be the same, and neither will tourism. We talked a bit about tourism and the Auckland situation in the last session, but discussions were already going on about the need to move to a more sustainable and carbon-neutral economy. And in that lockdown and the freeze of tourism, it really was a chance to reset and think about how do we move that forward, and how our economy should think about changing for the long-term good of New Zealand and in the climate change space, the whole world. So we would say that the reset made us think, with COVID, trade-offs that might have seemed impossible prior to that crisis were starting to be seen in a more credible light. Necessity is the mother of invention. We had to do some things differently immediately. So the groups that we talked to seemed quite supportive of the idea that it was time for a green economic reset, and to truly think about things like a circular economy and how we change the way we think about making money and living. So basically, the outcome was that we needed a reset with a sense of purpose. It's obviously a time of profound change, and we shouldn't really be squandering this opportunity to actually have a strategy. So that came through on a lot of those different issues we talked in the different sectors. One of those reports, and I think I'll be putting up the slide of that again, was on the food sector and moving towards sustainable agriculture, and how during lockdown that the food sector was actually pretty well off. It was still needed, our goods were needed overseas, but we had a chance to think about what does brand New Zealand, whatever you want to call that, can we capitalize on our culture and on our environmental values and our food safety, etc., to change the way we think about our exports, not just a commodity, but high-value exports. These were two of the reports that actually had quite some of the most impact. And as I was just mentioning, one was about the food sector that keeps coming back. People still want to have that conversation, and the Aotearoa Circle is carrying on a lot of work to generate a New Zealand food strategy. But I'll end it on the environment, because we do need to just reinforce that in all the decisions we make here, that we not lose sight of our sustainable ways of thinking, that we need to keep that in all of the decisions moving forward, rather than getting caught up in our immediate concerns, that all of the decisions need to consider the environment and climate change impacts when we are making our plans, that we need to look to the long term. What's next? The last report just summed up where we're going with this, and we still have a lot of issues to face, including talking about education and reforming the education system. What does it mean now? How do we educate our young people for the future, considering these what we face now and what we know? We need to build resilience and skills and critical thinking for the future. We need to think about enhancing our democratic decision-making and breaking down some of the structural barriers to equal access to power and influence. And we are working on various methods of developing participatory and deliberative processes to have conversations on these complex issues. As I've mentioned, reimagining our economic future for sustainability and resilience, and building on our strengths, what we have shown as strengths through COVID, not to squander those opportunities for establishing a path to a better future. Thank you.
Fine. Hang on a second, if I may just detain you for one moment, Anne, with any questions for Anne on that quick run-through of that extensive array of reports, again, either by Slido or in person. May I just ask a couple? To what extent does the climate crisis loom through all your reports as the dominant driver or a driver of change, and to the extent to which it in itself is a focus for your deep thinking beyond just the COVID impacts?
Well, I've been involved a lot in climate change risk assessment. It came up from the very beginning of our broad discussion about impacts going forward from COVID. It actually has touched through pretty much all of those reports. I mean, even in the social cohesion, mental health, youth stresses about eco-anxiety. It's a driving force through a lot of what we do. I'm not sure if that's answering your question.
Partly, but I'm just trying to take it a bit further, if I may, in terms of how it changes the thinking. So, for example, the most astonishing report out this time yesterday from the International Energy Agency, where they are saying absolutely no more investment in finding more oil and gas fields. And here is the first step towards, here is a pathway to net zero energy system for the world by 2050. So that's a huge, huge change in their thinking. Now, they've been working towards that for some years. So that's why I'm interested in whether through your work, the focus on the climate crisis has brought about some big changes in your thinking rather than kind of an extension of where thinking had been going on multiple issues.
Well, I mean, I don't think the climate crisis is something that we've just discovered, so we have been thinking about it for quite a long time. I mean, I didn't really touch on, and Donnell will, that one of the trajectories that we need to take for New Zealand is to get away from carbon-intensive economic models and towards a knowledge economy, which I think Donnell is going to discuss. So it's been in our thinking that we also need to think about the just transition, and that's you just leap to solutions, no importation of fossil fuels, and we have to be able to define what that pathway is to get there, that's not disadvantaging people who are already suffering and not yeah. So.
No, that's fine. Thank you. I'll leave it at that point. A big hand for Anne. Thank you very much indeed. Now this is where Peter comes back for some more thoughts on Auckland. Over to you, Peter. Thanks.
Those of you who were at the talk I gave at the meeting that Auckland Unlimited ran last Friday can shut their ears now, go to sleep, because you've heard all of this, and I'm going to do it very rapidly because of time. But we have Auckland Unlimited ask us to prepare and use our thinking, and we've had discussions also with the other agencies and with APO and with Treasury and MB, to think through where Auckland might go and could go 20 to 30 years from here. So looking beyond the transactional issues which must dominate most councils and most governments, to try and look further out. And the way we've chosen to do that is to, first of all, just be honest about the challenges. The first challenge is the perception of Auckland outside Auckland. The issue is most New Zealanders don't realise that Auckland is its biggest asset. Most New Zealanders don't recognise that it is, in fact, nearly 40% of the population. It is a fundamental asset that the economy of Auckland drives the rest of New Zealand in many ways. And that's not been sold to the rest of New Zealand. It's also not been sold to the rest of New Zealand that Auckland's very different in many ways, not as just because it's a pile of orange cones and transport issues and complaints, which is what much of New Zealand sees Auckland as. Jaffas, God knows what, we could go there. But officials in Wellington will readily admit to me they do not understand Auckland. Their concept of Auckland, the diversity of our peoples, the way we have our history as a mercantile city rather than as a Wakefield settlement, the issues of different relationships, much more, in many ways, and I don't want to diminish what's gone on, but there's been a lot of interaction with the iwi and hapu of Auckland in different ways to elsewhere in the country. There is a lot going on here that's very different. But the demography of Auckland, the business model, the culture of Auckland is sufficiently different. We have not sold that is an asset to the rest of New Zealand. We've not done that systematically or well, and I'll come back to that momentarily. The second issue is, 10 years into the super city, what's common between Dairy Flat and Flatbush? We don't actually think yet as a city. Some people do. If the Blues won every time, maybe we would think of it differently. And I'm not, but you know, what does give us civic pride? What does give us a sense that the city belongs to the nearly 2 million people that live in Auckland? There's issues here that we need to think through, and we can build on that. The third issue that is really important, and Dornell is going to talk about it, so I'm not going to steal her thunder, is cities exist because they're advantageous for people to live in cities. And whatever anybody else thinks, people are going to continue to migrate to Auckland, both internally and externally, and any estimate of Auckland's growth is probably going to be on the underside, not on the overside. We'll be 2 million people soon, and go beyond that. Irrespective of government policy, cities exist because there are psychic, economic and other reasons why people want to agglomerate. But one of the reasons most important is agglomeration should be economic growth. And unfortunately, Auckland does not demonstrate the agglomeration effect of economic growth appropriate for the size of a city in a country of this size. Now, there are reasons for it which need to be explored and addressed, but equally because we have not shown the agglomeration effect to the extent we should have, Wellington looked at Auckland just as a large number of people living in one place and they don't know how to play rugby, rather than recognising this to be the economic engine. So this issue of the failure of the agglomeration effect in Auckland is a critical issue that we in Auckland need to own, not just leave it to Treasury to own, and we need to address it as a whole. If Auckland is to achieve its dream, which I think everybody will have, they can at the highest level say we want to be a globally relevant city, we want to be an important city, we want to be economically well, we want to be environmentally sensitive, etc., etc. We can all say those high-level things, greater equity, deal with the issues. We can all say that, but without actually addressing this agglomeration deficit, it's going to mean nothing. And so that's a critical issue that we're focused on, and Dornell will talk about a bit more. And related to all of this is our citizens are not well engaged. Oh, they'll scream up and down about orange cones and Quay Street or whatever, but local body elections are not engaging. Local body elections have a low turnout. It links to this issue of civic pride. It actually has a lot of issues, and if we want a city that is cohesive and an engine which is working economically, it also has to work socially. And therefore we need to think seriously about the opportunities of how do we use the advantages of new developments and participatory and deliberative democracy, and Koitu is heavily involved in some of those, to actually engage our citizens more than, and I don't mean this rudely, but what are relatively tokenistic consultations that go on about the issues of Auckland into the future. And that leads on to the big question, and I could go on at length. I mean, one of the issues that I think about is what is the role is local body democracy, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But the issue, let's stop moaning, let's think positively. We have assets that are not exploited. I'm not allowed to use the word exploited, have not been which could be used much better to more advantage for New Zealand. I have word police in my department, in my units. And I'm just going to mention 3 of them. It's universities, not just Auckland, but AUT, Massey as well. I know of no city of this size in the world which has its university sector so disconnected from the business sector, so disconnected from the social sector as these 3 universities are. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't individual academics who walk the talk, but structurally we don't have it. Waterloo, Canada, Tel Aviv, Geneva, I could go on, Copenhagen, Helsinki, the structural relationships and the behavioural and cultural relationships between the universities, with 7,000 academics probably across the 3 of them, maybe more, 70,000 students, of which a growing number are graduate students. There's a resource here which we need to think differently about. It's diversity. More than 30% Asian, close to 40% soon. Maori, Pacifica. These are not to be seen as problems, these are assets. Diversity of view is something that we've learnt over the years is a real intellectual strength. What we need to do is build on that. Our Asian population, the world is turning to Asia. We have more depth here in a positive sense around Asians than many other countries. How do we use that? New Zealand is going to has to face and confront constitutional change before 2040. As the largest population of Maori in the country, how do we engage in that and actually show a way to be constructive? There are opportunities galore in this if you think it through and think of it from the positive lens rather than from the downside lens. And then Auckland is made up of the amalgamation of villages and towns that have gradually amalgamated over 180 years into this big agglomeration. many of those had actually distinct characteristics. They do have distinct characteristics. Many of them, even from the merger from the super city only 10 years ago, had some distinct characteristics. Our problem in Auckland is we have not thought that those distinct characteristics become a real asset. And we need to actively, proactively, how do you build a precinct? You build something that that people want to live around and work around. We have a precinct in Auckland, but it's not the precinct we want. It's called the Auckland Grammar Zone. People have moved to be around that because people want their kids to go to a great school. Why don't we have great schools in West Auckland, South Auckland, in North Auckland? We probably do, but why are we not promoting it and making them more accessible? Are health services equally distributed? No. I'll come back to that. But most importantly of all, how do we create work opportunities that are meaningful and in those in South Auckland, West Auckland, North Auckland, to reduce the amount of internal travel in Auckland? If people could work closer to home, and we had more of a hub and spoke model, model which moved people around the outsides, we would change a lot of issues in Auckland. Why is Auckland not the Hollywood of Auckland? West Auckland, the Hollywood of Auckland. Why do we have the dance school and the drama school and all of that in the centre of the town rather than out in West Auckland? Or something like out there. Am I stealing your thunder? I'm sorry. I'll shut up then. Okay. I'll stop. I'm getting into a rave. But the point I'm making is there are assets in Auckland that could be developed. They need sensitive, strategic thinking through, and they need partnerships. One of the problems here is all that I've mentioned require partnerships between different players rather than just the council coming up with a plan or the University of Auckland thinking it can have a plan or whatever having a plan. What we need to do is see that what are the core assets of Auckland, and we will be writing a report stating what we think the core assets of Auckland are, and how over a 10 to 20 year period we could use those to turn this city into a more global city. And I think at that point I'd better shut up and introduce Dornell Klein, who is an economist in Koitu. Her background is particularly in the economics of poverty and disadvantage, but she's going to talk more generally today, specifically on the issues of agglomeration and on the issues of the Auckland economy and how we move that forward. We'll take all the discussion at the end, Rod, and move on to Dornell.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Peter, for introducing me. He did speak a bit much on what I'm going to be covering. Now he got a little bit carried away, so you might be hearing some of the same things being repeated here. So he introduced the Auckland Unlimited project that we're currently working on. So we're working on the future of Auckland, where we'll see Auckland in 20, 30, 40 years down the line. So thinking more in strategic terms of ways to go forward. And we're aptly titling it Accelerating Auckland. So we're trying to provide ambitious but realistic options to suggest pathways for an innovative, a livable, and sustainable future for Auckland moving forward. And with the theme of what's happening this evening, seeing beyond the disease, of course, means recognizing the consequences of COVID, which is likely to be long-term, and we need to think about that as we think about Auckland's future going forward. So this is what a lot of what was in this actual provocation that was produced last year, Rethinking Our Future, COVID-19 as a catalyst for innovation. And a lot of what this covered was focusing on the recovery from the pandemic, and looking broadly at New Zealand and considering ways to advance the economy's economic, social, cultural, environmental well-being going forward. And so it's very broad, and what we're working on, the project that we're working on, is going to cover a lot of different domains. But this evening I'm going to focus mostly on the agglomeration effects and innovation and in thinking of ways to move forward. So I'm going to start with the agglomeration effect, and Peter covered some of this in his last bit of the speech here. So cities exist because they are productive. And what we've seen, so since the formation of the super city about 10 years ago, Auckland's productivity uplift from agglomeration was just not as good as we would reasonably expect. For comparable cities, we found that and before I move forward, does everyone know what agglomeration effects mean? So it's those effects of efficiencies that are derived from firms and households, businesses being close together. And that's why so many cities around the world are productive. But comparing internationally, Auckland is falling behind a bit in this realm. So if you look at cities, say like London, which contains about 13% of the UK population, they're producing about 23%, so almost quarter of the GDP for the UK. Copenhagen is another example. So it's about a third of the Danish population, so about more than 40% of the GDP comes from Copenhagen. And we're not seeing that here in Auckland. And as Peter mentioned, of course, this sort of has led Wellington to believe that the agglomeration effect is not meaningful for New Zealand. But that being said, by some measures, Auckland is already more productive than other parts of New Zealand. It is the primary city in New Zealand. But the city's low efficiency compared to other global cities, as I said, has led to sort of deny that importance of agglomeration. And I think what we need going forward is to not just toss it aside, but think about why that is and think about ways to actually create agglomeration effects moving forward. And that should probably be one of the big focus of decision makers, and to really think about ways to realize Auckland's potential. So why are agglomeration effects lacking? Which takes me to my next point. So the role of cities as hubs of innovation could be a way to improve agglomeration effects. So Auckland is quite unique because of how it's set up. Everything's quite dispersed around the region, which makes it a very sort of interesting region to deal with. And what the research has shown is that smaller, more specialized cities are more likely to benefit from effects of agglomeration. And because of this unique region that we have, this is something that should be considered in when we're making the decision. So for a city like Auckland to be a city of scale, especially considering these dispersions, setting up specialized innovation hubs across the region might be one way to actually go forward. Sorry?
We can stop subsidizing sport.
That's another thing. It seems that the assumption right now is that if there's regional development, then this is sufficient to drive economic development for all, and we're seeing that is probably not happening. We're seeing all this inequities across the region, which means that it's not working for the entire region. So to promote innovation and these knowledge-intensive hubs for Auckland to compete in a technologically progressive world could probably be a way forward, and I can get back to that in a few slides. Another issue to consider in thinking about the future of Auckland, which Peter also touched on, is the tertiary education sector. So we have about 70,000 students across the Auckland region, and perhaps about 7,000 academics to go along with it. And it is one of the major under-leveraged assets of Auckland. Unlike some other global cities, just Auckland has failed to recognize the universities as a major asset. Many major innovative cities around the world have forged these connections between the university and the public sector and business sector, which is not really what we're seeing happening here. And the examples were given of Silicon Valley, of Stanford University, providing the knowledge and the graduates that actually were essential to the success of businesses, of companies like HP or Google or Apple, and we see the same sort of things in places like Tel Aviv or Waterloo in Canada, and there are examples around Auckland also. Soul Machines. So if you were at the conference last Friday, the Auckland Futures Now, Greg Cross talked about how those synergies between the university and the business actually was one of the things that led to the success of the AI company. But this is probably not the rule, and the relationship between the university and the public sector really should be fostered. Another area is probably investment in R&D, and we have very low investment into R&D compared to other small advanced economies. So looking at ways to boost R&D is another way looking to go forward, and also looking at the people and talent to drive innovation. Of course, the skills of academia could be a huge asset here in driving innovation, but I think, as Anne mentioned when she was speaking earlier, we may be missing the boat on actually bringing talent in from overseas. There is a lack of skills diversity across Auckland, and it's something that's also needed to push innovation forward. So attracting talented people to drive innovation should probably be top of mind. And just get on board, and before we miss that window, if we haven't already missed that window, because places like the UK, US, Singapore already sort of on this aggressive hunt for talent, as more and more of their population becomes vaccinated, and so we have a bit we're poised to have some leverage there with our COVID-free environment. Another area where there might be innovation opportunities is looking at large companies. Large companies are a basis for global success, and there are very few in Auckland. And the ones that do exist probably are just branch offices of companies, of Australian companies or other foreign companies. So with little real innovation role to leverage off of, and to create the innovation systems that we really need if we're looking at a smart city in the future. And so the reality is, to become a magnet for innovation, we need some bold incentives. Because we're competing with places like Sydney and Melbourne and Singapore. So providing these incentives to help boost R&D within Auckland is probably another way that we could think of going forward. Which brings us back to the precinct opportunity and challenge, as was mentioned earlier. So an innovation strategy that deliberately fosters intensive hubs, knowledge-intensive hubs, is probably needed to compete in a technologically progressive world. So Peter spoke about the hub and spoke model with clear identities across the region, is something that we can probably look into. And with this, as you were saying, you know, West Auckland could be or Hollywood or South Auckland, you know, are filled with a lot of cultural diversity and innovation, and these are assets that can be leveraged for a better future. So why not build, you know, institutes in these areas to actually develop the skill sets that are part of these regions, and develop these hubs all across the Auckland region, and could be a way to actually go forward. And there are many benefits that could come along with such a model. Of course, the first one is you're able to develop skill sets of the people there, and this will also attract more investment. If there's already investment into these places, this will attract even more investment, more amenities, and this snowball effect, which will lead to more of a development of these hubs. And all of this will drive innovation, which is what we're talking about a knowledge economy in the future. And also looking things like less barriers for skill development. So if you don't have to travel very far, or if these different hubs are set up at different regions, it's not far for you to go to actually develop your skill set, and that could lead to high value jobs in the future. It could lead to more sort of get rid of some of those inequities in health, in education, and other services across the region, and hopefully over time increase people's quality of life, and just moving towards more of that, garnering more of that civic pride and having an identity that's linked to the Auckland region. So that's sort of what I have to talk about this evening. So looking at ways to deal with that agglomeration effect, and developing these hubs, these knowledge-intensive hubs around Auckland to drive that civic pride and towards a place where people want to live. Thanks.
We could do questions, yeah?
No.
Or you want us to do some more?
Yeah, we'll finish it off. Do what we're told. Who's in charge here? Before we open it up to questions, Dornell's talked about the economic side of it, but Tamaki Makaurau is also the place where people want to live. And as I said, we've already got, and that's the meaning of the word according to some translations, but there are different ways it all comes to the same view. This is a very special space where we have the privilege to live. And people want to keep on coming here. And no matter what policies are put in place, we will continue to grow disproportionately large. And we need to think about what we do to make sure that it's not just the people who want to live for economic reasons, but for social reasons. And so I might start in a place where we may not think to start. Lots of people talk about smart cities. What are smart cities? It's not just sensors for air pollution or sensors for traffic control. It can mean a lot more things. It could be urban farming. It could be green spaces that are designed to deal with mental health. It could be about greater use of autonomous vehicles. It could be many other things. There are in England now footpaths which actually generate energy when you walk on them. There are many ways in which we could turn this city in a very different way into being an edgy, future-focused city. Some of them, the economics of it needs to be worked through, admittedly. But why do we keep on building transport systems designed using 1980s technology rather than transport systems designed for 2040? When by the time we put them in place, they'll be 60-year-old technologies. Why should we not be thinking now about things like autonomous vehicles to manage transport, to move people through the city faster, etc., etc.? There are many ways we can think about it that are different. And so while I don't want to spend time on that tonight, it's a really important dimension which I hear nobody talking about. How do we actually think about a city that will be world class? We have brilliant engineers. I was privileged to spend time with Grant Dalton and his team at the request of both of them and Nick Hill to look at what they have there which might be exploited for Auckland's benefit if they won the Cup. Some of the work they've done on AI, human interfaces between machines and individuals using AI, is beyond belief. Why are we not building on that asset? Rocket Lab developed in Auckland. Why are we not thinking about that? There's Peter Hunter up there at the engineering school with a world-class in digital human engineering. I think the Soul Lab's been mentioned by Donnell, the Soul Machine, sorry. There are things here which, if we thought about them, could lead us to think not just about making money out of them, but how do we actually make a city that is really quite different, not science fiction-y different, but different in a way that both is economically vibrant, but socially vibrant as well, and where the kids in South Auckland who are all great at playing games could be inventing the games of the future or whatever. So I don't want to spend time on that. And it's already been mentioned. We have environs which are special. But a lot of Aucklanders don't even know they exist virtually. They don't have access to them. They don't know how to get access to them. How many Aucklanders have actually been on the harbour? You'd be surprised what a low percentage of the 2 million people living in Auckland have actually been on the harbour, have actually been to Mototap or Rangitoto or Tiri, seen the precious things we have there. I have a place in Piha. I'm addicted to the West Coast. And the number of times I would take a foreign visitor when they were allowed to come here for a walk on one of my favourite walks and say, we can walk for 8 hours and I bet we won't see another Aucklander. And yet we're only a few yards from 1.5 million people. Says something. We're not actually engaging, and particularly New Zealanders need to be engaged to understand what a totara is, or a rimu, or a kauri is, particularly the kauri before they disappear. We have cultural institutions and a broad range of amenities that could be. I was very disappointed when Te Papa did not build. I was on the board and we were stopped from building a branch of the Te Papa in South Auckland. Not just as a museum, but as an educational centre, as a place to actually give Pacifica and Maori people pride in their taonga. There was a lot that could have been done. It could have been turned into a tourist centre. Why do the tourists only have to see downtown Auckland? There's lots of other bits of Auckland we want them to see and experiences they should have. And a lot of people forget that Auckland has a large rural component. There's a significant rural component, which is going to have to be protected in some ways because it's some of the best fertile land in the Auckland region. But very few people outside probably the council officers or the people living in those rural areas actually, and certainly in Wellington, realise Auckland has a rural economy. It actually has a significant rural economy. And it's one that is part of Auckland's future, not something to deny. So, and then, I've already said all of this, but I want to come back to it. Diversity is our strength, not our weakness. Some people see it as just a giant social challenge, but the social challenges have to be confronted, addressed, health, education, etc., jobs. And what Dornell's talked about is about how you develop those jobs close to where people might live to reduce the burden. But the most valuable thing I learnt when when the Christchurch earthquake happened, I was charged with thinking about how people responded to the earthquake. And I did a lot of work for the government on thinking about that and came up with a line which has been quoted in Christchurch repeatedly ever since. And recovery is only there when people feel empowered to be back in control of their own lives. It wasn't about buildings, it wasn't about that, it was about being in control of their own lives. Now I think this word empowerment is really important in terms of a city getting social equity and getting the city to have civic pride. And I do not think we have a local democratic system that achieves that. Now, I could make some comments here that are probably out of order, so I'll make them anyhow. And that is to say, where else in the world where 40% of the population have a local body system that has relatively little authority over the way people's lives are lived? The level of local body authority compared to central government for 40% of the population is quite limited. Compare that to an Australian city, a British city, a Canadian city. The authority is, now because that authority is limited, of course people get confused about whether local body politics is important or not. I would add another highly controversial personal comment. Why do we have political parties? We have political parties because they form consensus between individuals of somewhat disparate worldviews, but under some broad umbrella, so that when people vote for National or ACT or Labour or Greens or Māori Party, they're buying into some sort of worldview package. They may not agree with everything that a political party has. And of course that allows governance, because governance needs a limited number of discourses to actually make things happen quickly. One of the unusual things about New Zealand local body politics is, by and large, it's free of partisan politics. Now, you could argue that's good, but you could actually argue it means the poor old mayor and the poor old officials are negotiating every time with 21 or whatever is the number of councillors, because they do not know which way the party system is going to sit itself down. And I think that is an inefficiency of governance, which means that people get elected, and you see it more overtly in smaller local bodies in New Zealand, on single issues, rather than on a platform of how the city will develop. And furthermore, in Auckland, or in any of the local body, because there are not the constellations as a stable, understood thing by the populace actually doesn't engage with it very well. So I just wonder whether, I can't think of another Western democracy in which partisan politics is not part of local body politics or regional politics. And so there is something there that I think we need to think about. Now, it's an area I wouldn't pretend to be an expert on, but I think it's something that just needs to be reflected on. It's not that we don't have well-meaning city councillors or we don't have well-meaning board members. I think they're all well-meaning, just as I think most parliamentarians, even if I disagree with them, are well-meaning. It's just that the system embeds a kind of inefficiency that is not there at the central government level. And so that's just worth thinking about. So we're going to stop there, just with that little, but I think there are other aspects of democracy to talk about. The use of digital democracy, the use of various forms of deliberative citizens' fora, for example. Should we have a citizens' assembly to deal with some, or citizens' jury to deal with some issues that are very values-laden? There are many different experiments in deliberative democracy or participatory democracy that are done overseas to deal with issues that New Zealand does not deal with well. And I could see some of the issues that council and council officers have dealt with over the years, which have been very contentious, may have been well advanced by having a citizens' assembly. It's not for everything. It certainly doesn't displace the role of the normative electoral processes, but when there are very contentious issues, it is a way of getting greater buy-in to solutions that need to be found, particularly if there's a high values component to them. And Auckland has its share of contentious issues and a lousy rugby team.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. Now, I've invited Anne and Donnell to come up too, because we've got 15 minutes for a lively discussion. So please do use the app or the microphones for some questions. Anyone going to leap up? Gentleman there. Here comes a microphone. Say you're getting up.
Thank you, Rod. Scott Milne, I'm involved in local body politics or governance in East Auckland. First of all, thank you all for your presentations, stimulating and somewhat provocative. I just wanted to pick up on comments that you made, Sir Peter, in your presentation about global autocratic moves by central governments, and also, Dr. Anne, your comments on empowerment at local body level. And we have seen in New Zealand some autocratic legislation come through, and particularly in Auckland at the moment, we are living under the COVID Fast Track Act, which has overtaken citizens' abilities to respond to resource consents via the Environment Court, and a potential loss of rights, one could say. Can you comment then on how these two activities react with each other, the rise of autocratic governance and the potential changes in empowerment that you see, Sir Peter, as being important to our city going forward? Thank you.
Well, I think they're two sides of the same coin. I mean, we're talking here about what is the social contract between an individual or a whānau and the state. And we have an implied contract that the state does certain things to help us, and we comply by being good citizens in different ways. I think autocracy is a form of disempowerment, because in fact democracy is designed with all its total imperfections to try and make people feel they have some empowerment over the shape of the future of their country. On the other hand, excess bureaucracy is also disempowering, and so the issues that have existed over time with the RMA and everything else and multiple complexities of decision making are also disempowering. And they're also very confusing for individuals, where autocracy is very clear. Who's the boss makes the call. So so there is, in a sense, it's how do you make people feel part, I hate to say this word, team. We've had the team of 5 million so much in the last 18 months. But actually that's what we're talking about in Auckland too. How do we get a team of 1.5 to 2 million people operating in Auckland, or a few 100,000 different parts of Auckland, to have a greater voice? So it's a delicate game to play, Scott, but it's one that has to be played, because otherwise you'll end up ultimately losing social cohesion. Social cohesion has two dimensions to it. It has trust between those governing and those being governed, and horizontal trust between people who have different worldviews but feel that they can live alongside each other because there's been a way of the process of those different worldviews being respected. And that's what New Zealand does better than anywhere else in the world. And Auckland does it very well. Auckland, for its remarkable diversity, actually does have a high level of social cohesion. We should see that as a tremendous asset and work out how we use that for advantage.
Peter, sorry, Anne, did you want to add to that?
I was just going to make a quick comment about the move towards autocratic rule in some places. I mean, crises, we know, would tend to make societies want strong leadership, and we've seen, that we've respected strong leadership in the beginning of the pandemic, but it could be a slippery slope, as we've seen, as we saw during the Trump administration, etc. So it is also a fact of crisis situations that has accelerated that move towards autocratic rule.
Peter, you're right to emphasise participatory democracy and the mechanisms for it, which are very much on the rise, democracy 2.0, some people might call it. But that's very much a response to the failure of the party political system. And therefore, are you arguing against yourself by, on one hand, suggesting channeling the national parties in through Auckland Council on one hand, but on the other hand, you're arguing for participatory democracy on the other?
Well, I think they serve different purposes, and I love arguing against myself. It's a great skill to argue against yourself. It's part of...
Well, as long as you're convincing.
It's part of the scientific process to ask questions of yourself and put opposite views ahead and think about it. But I don't think they are opposite, because you're looking at multiple different issues in governance. And so decisions have to be made. It comes back to Scott's point. Decisions actually do have to be made, and decisions are easier to make when you have less people in the room. So a committee of 1 does better than a committee of 20 by definition. And political parties effectively reduce the number of committees, number of positions in the room from 21 to, say, 3 or 4. That's its advantage. That's different to issues which have a high values component that cannot be dealt with through the political process in the normal way. And if you look at citizens' juries around the world, and I served on the OECD committee that looked at a lot of this, they tend to work on things which do not align with the normal axes around which political parties operate. So they're dealing with issues of high societal values content. The famous one is abortion in Ireland, or where to site a nuclear power station in France. They are issues which don't fit within the normative political process. And there are issues like that around Auckland that exist, I'm sure. So and they also, we're doing a bit of an experiment, we're trying to do an experiment in Auckland, in Koi too. Do people see a citizens' assembly pulled together on a particular issue as a way of showing others that diverse views have been taken into account? I think there's a lot to learn from Maori in this. I mean, the Maori process of achieving consensus is very different to the Pākehā way of achieving consensus. And in a sense, is there something to learn from that in the way we deal with issues that have a high values as opposed to an operational content? The citizens' juries really only work well for certain classes of action. They do not displace elected officials.
Thanks. Richard, a microphone right behind you.
Kia ora, I'm Richard, I'm one of the Auckland councillors. I guess I could have sat and not being rude to anyone here, because I think this is awesome, I love this kind of stuff, but I could have sat in the same kind of forum maybe 20 times in the last 6 or 7 years, aside from COVID. Is part of the issue that, from maybe one of your first points around no one's selling Auckland, no one's proud of Auckland, no one's talking about Auckland, but also that we sit in rooms of mostly Pākehā people talking about how bad everything is all the time, you know, and sort of a vacuum of leadership. I mean, I look at, and I'm sorry if Heart of the City are here, you know, we've got an issue with Heart of the City right now, complaining about how bad everything is while we're investing billions of dollars in the city. We've got everyone sort of saying how terrible Auckland is all the time, and then but we still have massive population growth, which means people still think it's all right. Like, that, you know, you talk about diversity and other things, but that's happening. Mana whenua are getting on with it. We've got, you know, you can go any part of this city, and we do have those precincts already. We're just not talking about them, celebrating them, including them. Like, I don't know what the answer is, but sort of all the problems suggested are already on their way. We just pretend that maybe that they're not happening.
I mean, I don't disagree with anything you said, but I think the issues are perceptional, and perception becomes reality for a lot of people. And perception matters in the way Auckland and the rest of New Zealand work. I think perception works in the way Aucklanders relate to you and other councillors and other people. I mean, this is a reality. But also, we are, in the work we're doing, we're trying not to look at what happens next week. I mean, for instance, I'm not going to address the question in our work where the port should be. I don't actually think that's a thing for me to look at. I don't care where the port is at one level, but the decision has to be made where it is. Because while that decision is not made, a whole lot of other things are held up. And I think that's the issue, that we need to get better at putting some pegs in the ground so we can move forward. I think that the issues, yes, when I look at what's going on in the Southern Initiative, it's fabulous. But 90% of Aucklanders don't know about it, or 99% of Aucklanders may not, and it's not being turned into something that brings the business community, other parts of the system, into seeing that part of Auckland as an opportunity. They tend to see it, and that's why our report, when it comes out, is going to focus not on the negative, it's going to focus on the assets of Auckland, and the assets that can be, and none of it's new. Obviously, there's lots of intelligent people who think about Auckland. The issue is how to be provocative and get above the churn of the immediate, to think about the churn of the future. And that's actually the challenge to think about. I, for instance, don't think I'm hearing a lot about what a smart city would be, what Auckland should look like in 2045, for example.
I was just going to comment more on the deliberative democracy processes and how they might help with that. I mean, we do hear people complain they don't actually understand where their rates are going and why Peter always likes to bring up why there's so many orange cones around all the time, and you know, some of the problems that you guys are all trying to address are really complex, and we are trying to bring a process where all those views can come together and actually be understood, and in a visible way that other people, even who aren't in the process, will see that, just people like you and me are in this, discussing it, really understanding what the issues are, seeing all the different perspectives, and coming up with a potential answer. So, I mean, we're only in the very beginnings of that, but I do think that's one way forward to get past all of the just complaining, not understanding it, you know.
Thank you. Yes.
You talked to one of the enduring legacies of COVID will be mostly acutely felt by youth, and that sits on a foundation of a population that has been underserved in a way, and as measured by well-being and mental health. And you also talked about the necessity that we need to be talking, particularly in terms of COVID and response and recovery. So I wondered, I work in MOE and largely in South Auckland, and where intentionally there is deliberate actions to engage youth in part of a problem solution around the recovery. We know that they are agentic, they're actively aware of the life that they're living and the impact that COVID had, and what kids talk to. We've always been living in COVID. They are desperate for platforms to participate and have access to these kinds of forums. In your work, where do you see the activation of youth leadership and agency, or just having access to participate in forums like this?
So that's actually part of the work that we're doing at KOI too. So we are actively involving the rangatahi in all of our research, and their voices are being heard, and it will be part of what comes out of this report. For instance, the one that we're focusing right now on the future of Auckland, a lot of the things that you were just talking about have been brought up about the future. How would we think about the future of infrastructure, the social fabric of society, when all this generation they've grown up a life of COVID, basically. They're used to staying home. They're used to doing things online, to socializing online, to going to school online. And what might their needs be in the future if they have such a view, this is their reality, and their needs might be different than ours are. So that's why when we're looking at our consultation, and I know we're just one organization, but when we're having these consultations, we're not just focusing on the older people or, only the Pākehā voices you were just talking about. We're trying to get it as diverse as possible. And I'm sorry, as you were mentioning earlier about the decisions about the future, I agree with you. I think it does need to be inclusive of people like the rangatahi, of a bit more representative of the Auckland population, having diverse set of voices because these different communities know what's best for them, and they need to be included in that conversation in one way or the other. And yeah, I agree with what you're saying.
I find it interesting because Donnell's leading this or organizing this group, and we have 3 rangatahi leaders in our group, and they want to meet without this guy in the room. So they want to have that conversation on their level and together. So
we actually have an agreement with our rangatahi group that they're engaged not just in our programs, but actually in our strategic thinking about what we will do. So the 3 co-chairs who we pay an honorarium to are actually engaged in all the working papers our board gets and everything else.
And do they connect hubs back into their friends?
Yes, they're invited to. It's all new because we're only young, but they actually set up their own groups.
Yeah, and we're letting them lead it because they know what's best for young people, and that's sort of the position that we're taking going forward.
they have their own questions to ask, not being led by us oldies.
Thank you. Simon, here comes the microphone. This is purely for recording purposes. I know you can project.
Thank you, Rod. My question is about process. I think it's beyond dispute that Auckland will have to substantially decarbonise its transport operations within really the next decade or two. And yet the council has, you could argue, fallen at the first hurdle with an attempt in only Hunga at the moment to block us 3 or 4 little side streets in order to encourage the locals to use the major roads and create safer spaces for people to walk and cycle and take their kids to school and so on. It has created a firestorm of fury. And it augurs terribly badly for the whole process of how we're going to make change. And I wonder whether you have a comment, any of the 3 of you have a comment on how we're going to progress this.
Well, I'll be honest, Simon, and say I was disappointed with the Climate Change Commission interim report. Not because of the technical content, although some of it I would have argued about some of the detail, but because they didn't highlight that in my judgment, in an accessible way and in a well understood way to lay people, most people who are not climate change experts, the trade-offs that are needed, the urgency of making them, and the compromises that need to be made. And I think until New Zealanders understand that there are trade-offs that have to be made to avoid the existential catastrophe that's ahead of us, decision-making is hard for people in decision-making. They will immediately get a backlash. And we have not yet, in my judgment, achieved an understanding and therefore an acceptability of the trade-offs that need to be made now, not just in 20 years' time, in terms of to deal with this existential crisis ahead of us. And so I think that at the end of the day, now, I mean, you're closer to the ground than I am, Simon, in this respect, but I think that at the end of the day, and this is an issue which we work with in the International Science Council, at the end of the day, the question is one, how do you change behaviours and attitudes? And you need societal change for the political process to be able to operate.
My own take on it is that the best lesson we can learn from the country's response to COVID is the importance of marketing.
Correct. We're saying the same
so
thing.
yes, the Climate Change Commission could have done a better job, and yes, the local board members maybe could have done a better job, but fundamentally, nobody has engaged in this question of transport and in that local area, sophisticated, high quality, good marketing. Nobody's thought that was important enough to do.
Well, I think it's actually more complex than that. I actually think we've become attuned over the last 30 years to silver bullet approaches as a simple solution to anything. And what we are facing now in this constellation of transformations we face, technological change, climate change, demographic change, sociological change, economic change, is the fact that there are no silver bullets. We're actually looking at complex systems that have to be changed. And to understand complex systems, you have to explain those complex systems to people in ways they can understand, and explain the trade-offs, and that there's no free lunch, that there are costs to any decision that are made because it has systems effects. Now that's part of what we were set up to do, but it's taken us a while to find our mojo there, partly because of COVID. But I think at the end of the day, marketing without buying the population into understanding that there is no free lunch, that there are decisions that will have to be made that have consequences, both good and ones they may not like, is really important. And we don't do that kind of discussion very well in New Zealand. I mean, compared to many countries, we don't. The fourth estate is not in a strong position in New Zealand to manage, and with respect to you and to Rod, but in general, the fourth estate is not giving a lot of depth to these discussions in a way that's accessible to everybody.
Yes, Patrick, thank you.
I'm torn. There's a lot of things I'd like to raise.
Just blurt out.
Well,
front of mind.
Can I just say two? Just two. One of which, all three of you, I think our culture, as public intellectuals, I think this is a thing our culture does not push forward. We do not elevate poets to being ambassadors, as Allende's Chile did, for example. So the fourth estate may be lacking, but are there structural barriers in our universities to academics joining especially contentious political conversations? I just want to leave that question sitting there, because I think there are, and I think they have commercial sides, and I think Auckland University, my alma mater, has actually been a very poor player in Auckland's development. I'll just park that one. The second one, really for Donnell, is the question of agglomeration. Agglomeration is really a simple idea, isn't it? It's essentially concentration, the value of concentration and proximity. Auckland and all of New Zealand, and now especially since the quakes, Christchurch, are physically blousy, flabby, dispersed places, just physically anti-agglomerative. Yet we continue to subsidise, and I mean subsidise, the Southern Growth Initiative, Transport for Growth here. Public money goes into spreading out over these great rural areas that won't be rural much longer. They'll be McMansioned. So isn't this really quite a simple function of urban form that is one of our key problems? It just seems very clear. You mentioned Copenhagen. We can do a simple math. Denmark's similar population to Auckland. GDP per capita is 50% higher. Car ownership is half. And please don't say autonomous vehicles. All of the evidence is that these are dispersive, not constrictive. They do not concentrate.
I'll also point out Auckland, New Zealand and Denmark had exactly the same GDP in 1980, and it's worth thinking about what is the distinction between Denmark and New Zealand since then.
Yeah, quite a lot.
R&D. Huge deficits in New Zealand compared to Denmark. And they have large multinationals based there, which we do not have. And I think one underestimates the importance of those large multinationals in the Danish economy. Maersk, Novo, etc.
Vistas.
Etc. Lego. Really important, at least to my grandchildren. I think we've got to... one of the things is, and it comes back to the comment that was made from somewhere over there before, you've got to look forward, not backwards. You need to understand how we got to where we are. But the issue is we're stuck with Auckland in its shape as it is now, horizontal, going to continue to grow, which I think everybody agrees it's going to be more vertical in its growth. But where that verticality is and how that's clustered together doesn't mean it all has to be in the CBD. And so I think that...
You say that like it's a bad thing.
Huh?
I'm not sure you understand urban form.
Well, I may not understand urban form. I don't understand a lot of things. But the point, and that's not my job, my point is we need to think more about the city's future as a whole and what it is to live in the city and what that means in multiple dimensions, be it in terms of education, health, economics, and so forth. Yes, there will be domains which experts will have different views on. That's healthy. That's the whole point. Our job, which we were briefed on by Auckland Unlimited to do, was to be provocative to start the questioning, not to make the answers. And so I would love a debate about urban form. That's not a debate that should not be had. Of course it's a debate that needs to be had. But it doesn't need us to answer it. We're not the ones fit to answer it. But we may be the right ones to say it's a debate, a discussion that needs to be held.
Well, we do need all the evidence and all the voices on the table, so bring it on.
Donnell, a last thought from you.
I think he covered.
Right, sure, thank you. Sadly, I'm going to stop at that point because we're well over time. I just want to thank very much Peter and Anne and Dornell for their work. So a big hand for them for their work and their presentation. Gave us a great deal of food for thought tonight about the complexity of COVID as an endemic proposition and how we might reset with purpose, but understanding about how we might understand Auckland better in terms of cohesion, engagement and empowerment. I just had done before this evening a tiny bit of agglomeration maths. Auckland has 30% of the population of the country and 38% of GDP. So in other words, Auckland contributes more than double to GDP than, say, the primary sector does. This is, but we still have lots to do. We were somewhat behind Copenhagen, for example, on that similar metric. I won't make any other attempt to draw a few thoughts out. I will just end, though, if I may, self-indulgently on a personal note, which is Auckland is the 7th city I've called home in my life so far. Auckland is the smallest city I've called home so far. Auckland is in many ways the best city I've called home so far, and I've lived in Auckland far longer than I've lived anywhere else, which is why I'm more excited about the future of Auckland than I am about any other place I know. So thank you, and stay tuned because there's an awful lot more in this process still to happen, and encourage everyone in the city to express their hopes and their fears for the city so we can find a way to progress. The bar is open, which you might need, for conviviality terms rather than sucker. So please do enjoy the chance to continue the conversation there. And lastly, a very big thank you to Ashley McIntyre. Big hand for Ashley, who sits there very quietly but works very hard to make these things happen. And to the AV team as well. So thank you. Go well and enjoy the city.